The St. Mary's Church choir practice had always been held on Thursday evenings at 7:30, a ritual as fixed in the calendar of Little Paddleton as the seasons themselves. Miss Marple had attended most of these practices for the better part of 4 decades, sitting in the third pew with her knitting, ostensibly keeping to herself while her needles clicked away in that familiar rhythm that seemed to complement rather than disturb the singers. The church was cold this time of year, early November, and the stone walls seemed to absorb the chill and amplify it, making even the most spirited rendition of Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, sound somewhat mournful. Tonight, however, something was distinctly different about the atmosphere, something that made Miss Marple set down her knitting with more deliberation than usual and regard the assembled choir members with renewed interest. The occasion was the annual Harvest Festival concert, scheduled for the following Saturday evening, and rehearsals had been proceeding with the kind of careful orchestration that Reverend Whitmore prided himself upon. He was a meticulous man, the Reverend, precise in his sermon delivery and exacting in his musical standards, which is why his face had taken on such a peculiar shade of crimson when he discovered that the soprano solo in Handel, Since by Man Came Death, would need to be substantially revised. The singer who was meant to perform it, Mrs. Victoria Harrington, had quite suddenly decided that she could no longer participate. She had sent a note that very afternoon, delivered by her daughter-in-law Margaret, stating only that pressing family matters required her immediate attention and that she regretted the inconvenience caused. The note had been brief to the point of rudeness, and Reverend Whitmore was not a man accustomed to rudeness, particularly not from Mrs. Harrington, who had held the position of soprano soloist for nearly 15 years. Miss Marple, now 78 years old, had seen enough of human nature to recognize that such an abrupt withdrawal indicated something considerably more significant than mere pressing family matters. Mrs. Harrington was the sort of woman who scheduled her life with almost obsessive precision, who would no sooner miss a choir practice than she would appear in the village without her hair properly set. She had never, to Miss Marple's recollection, cancelled an engagement of any kind without weeks of advance notice and detailed explanation. That a woman of such rigid habit should suddenly withdraw from her most prominent musical role suggested that something had genuinely frightened her. Something serious enough to override years of dutiful performance and pride in her position. Yet nobody else seemed to register this oddity with any real concern. Reverend Whitmore was too preoccupied with finding a replacement soprano, and the other choir members were mostly relieved that their passages could remain unchanged. The replacement had quickly been found in the form of Miss Eleanor Finch, a thin, nervous woman in her 50s who taught at the village school and possessed a technically excellent soprano voice, though one entirely devoid of Mrs. Harrington's warmth and stage presence. Eleanor was grateful for the opportunity, almost embarrassingly so, and she had thrown herself into the rehearsal with an intensity that suggested she believed her performance might somehow determine the entire trajectory of her life. As the choir worked through the Handel piece, Eleanor's voice soared above the others with crystalline precision, and yet Miss Marple found herself barely listening to the music at all. Instead, her attention kept drifting to the choir loft, specifically to the small wooden desk. Positioned at the front, where the soprano soloists always stood during rehearsals, and where Eleanor's sheet music now rested on top of a curious little pile of objects. It was after the practice had concluded, as the choir members were gathering their coats and making their way toward the exit, with that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and relief that accompanied the end of a successful rehearsal, that Miss Marple made her way up the narrow stone stairs to the choir loft. She did so with the kind of unhurried casualness that had always characterized her movements, as though she were simply checking to ensure all the lights had been switched off, a task that technically fell to Reverend Whitmore but which she had taken upon herself on numerous occasions. The choir loft was dim, lit only by the reflected light from the church below, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust. The pile she had noticed turned out to be quite insignificant upon closer inspection. A pencil, an eraser, a small hymn book left behind from some previous practice, and beneath these items, just barely visible, the corner of what appeared to be a white envelope. Miss Marple picked up the envelope with careful fingers, the way one might handle something fragile or potentially contaminated. It was addressed, in handwriting she recognized immediately as Mrs. Harrington's precise, controlled script to V.H. and nothing more. The envelope was unsealed, and inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. She unfolded it with a kind of deliberate care that suggested she was already anticipating that its contents might prove significant. The letter was dated the previous day, Wednesday, and it contained only 3 lines, written in the same careful hand as the address. "I know what you did. I cannot look you in the eye any longer. Do not attempt to contact me. Everything will be revealed. The Sig." Nature was simply M, a single initial that could have belonged to anyone, though Miss Marple already suspected she knew who M might be. What troubled her more, however, was the nature of the threat, if threat it could be called. It was not a letter of anger or accusation. It was something far more chilling. It was a letter written by someone who had reached a point of such profound moral distress that they could no longer maintain the pretense of ordinary social interaction. She heard footsteps on the church steps below and quickly returned the letter to its envelope, replacing it precisely where she had found it, beneath the hymn book and other items. By the time Reverend Whitmore appeared at the bottom of the choir loft stairs, calling out to ask if she was still there, Miss Marple was already making her way down toward him, her expression serene and her manner entirely unsuspicious. She had been up in the loft, she explained, simply making sure everything was tidy and secure. The Reverend nodded, accepting her explanation without question, as most people did, and together they walked out into the cold November evening. The church doors locked behind them with a solid click that seemed to Miss Marple to echo far more loudly than it should have, and as she began her short walk home, her mind was already beginning to work through the puzzle that had just presented itself. The question was no longer simply why Mrs. Harrington had withdrawn from the choir. The question was far more urgent. What had Mrs. Harrington discovered that frightened her enough to write such a letter, and to whom had she actually intended to send it? Miss Marple's cottage was situated at the far end of Church Lane, a small stone dwelling with a perfectly maintained garden that had become something of a local landmark. The roses that grew along the front path were still blooming despite the advanc. Ing season, their deep crimson petals somehow managing to look both fragile and defiant against the November chill. She had lived there alone since the death of her husband nearly 30 years ago, though the cottage was never truly quiet. There was always the gentle sound of the kettle, the soft rustling of knitting needles, the occasional visit from village friends who came ostensibly to ask her advice on matters of domestic concern, but who invariably ended up sharing confidences that they seemed to think would be safer within her 4 walls than anywhere else in Little Paddleton. It was this characteristic of small villages, Miss Marple had long ago concluded, that made them such excellent laboratories for the study of human nature. People confessed to village elders the secrets they would never dare articulate in the city, as though the rural setting itself demanded a certain authenticity, a stripping away of the polished facades that urban life permitted. That evening, as she settled into her comfortable armchair with her knitting and a cup of Earl Grey tea, Miss Marple's mind returned repeatedly to the letter she had discovered in the choir loft. She had not removed it, of course. Doing so would constitute theft, and more importantly, it might alert the person who had hidden it to the fact that someone had discovered its location. Instead, she had committed the contents to memory with the precision that age had somehow enhanced rather than diminished, and now she turned the puzzle over in her mind like a piece of a jigsaw, examining it from every possible angle. The letter had been written by someone identified only as M, someone who claimed to know what the recipient had done and who had reached a point where they could no longer maintain their ordinary social relationships as a result of this knowledge. The recipient, judging by the initial 5th H and the Conte. XT of its placement in the choir loft was almost certainly Victoria Harrington. What had Victoria Harrington done that could inspire such a reaction? Miss Marple had known Victoria for many years, had observed her through various stages of life, had watched her navigate the complex social dynamics of the village with the kind of strategic precision that suggested she had always known exactly what she was doing. Victoria was a woman of means, the widow of a successful businessman who had left her comfortably provided for, and she had used her financial security to establish herself as one of the primary arbiters of social acceptability in Little Paddleton. She was the sort of woman who could make or break social standing through the simple expedient of including or excluding someone from her famous garden parties. Her opinions on matters both trivial and significant carried weight, and she wielded this influence with a kind of casual authority that suggested she had never questioned her right to do so. But what lay beneath this carefully constructed exterior? What secrets did Victoria Harrington guard so jealously that a simple letter threatening their revelation could send her into such disarray that she would abandon her most cherished public role? The following morning, Miss Marple attended the village post office, a small establishment run by Mr. Barnaby, a man in his 60s who had perfected the art of appearing to busy himself with sorting mail while actually absorbing every scrap of gossip that passed through his domain. Miss Marple purchased a single first-class stamp and made casual conversation about the weather, a subject she had discovered years ago could lead any person to reveal far more than they initially intended. It was while discussing the likelihood of frost that evening that Mr. Barnaby happened to mention, quite as though the thought had simply occurred to him, that Mrs. Harrington had been in the post office the previous morning looking distinctly unwell. She had inquired about international postal rates, he added, a detail that seemed to strike him as unusual enough to warrant special mention. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully, thanked Mr. Barnaby, and made her way to the village shop, where she knew she would find Mrs. Dorothy Summers, the proprietor, who had been Victoria Harrington's closest friend for more than 20 years. Dorothy was arranging tins of biscuits in the shop window when Miss Marple entered, and she looked up with a kind of smile that suggested she was pleased to have a visitor, even if that visitor was primarily interested in acquiring a ball of knitting wool. Miss Marple selected a suitable shade of blue, paid for it, and then asked, with a kind of innocent casualness that had become her trademark, whether Dorothy had seen Victoria recently. The question seemed to produce an immediate tension in Dorothy's shoulders, a subtle stiffening that would have been invisible to anyone less practiced in the observation of human behavior than Miss Marple. Dorothy admitted that she had not seen Victoria in several days, that in fact Victoria had been rather distant lately, declining invitations in a manner quite unlike herself. There had been a telephone call, Dorothy mentioned, the night before last, when Victoria had sounded strange, preoccupied, as though her mind were elsewhere entirely. When Dorothy had asked if anything was wrong, Victoria had simply said that she was feeling tired and needed to withdraw from social activities for a time. This conversation, Miss Marple reflected, as she walked homeward with her knitting wool, revealed precious little in terms of concrete facts, but suggested quite a great deal about the state of Victoria Harrington's emotional condition. A woman did not simply decide to withdraw from 40 years of carefully constructed social prominence without good cause. The telephone call that had preceded her withdrawal, the inquiry about international postal rates, the hastily written letter expressing knowledge of something shameful, these details began to coalesce into a pattern that suggested Victoria was not merely reacting to a threat, but was actively engaged in some form of crisis response. The question remained, who was M, the author of the letter? Miss Marple made a mental list of the village women whose names began with M as she climbed the gentle hill that led to her cottage. There was Margaret Finch, Eleanor's sister, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. There was Mrs. Margaret Stone, the wife of the bank manager. There was Molly Hutchins, the young maid who worked at Thornfield Manor. And, Miss Marple added with a small internal smile, there was Millicent Webb, the vicar's wife, though she seemed far too preoccupied with her own pursuits to involve herself in village drama. That evening, Miss Marple received a visitor in the form of Reverend Whitmore himself, who arrived at her door looking considerably more agitated than his usual pastoral composure typically permitted. He had come, he explained, to discuss a matter of some delicacy regarding the choir. It appeared that Victoria Harrington had sent him a formal letter of resignation from her position as soprano soloist, effective immediately and with no indication of when or if she might return. More troubling still, the letter had arrived with a request that her involvement in the church music program be kept absolutely confidential. that no explanation be offered to the other choir members, and that if anyone inquired about her absence, they should be told simply that she was taking a sabbatical for personal reasons. Reverend Whitmore confessed, Ed, that he was bewildered by this request and concerned about Victoria's well-being, though he hesitated to intrude upon what appeared to be a private matter. Miss Marple listened with full attention, asked a few gentle questions about the tone of the letter and the specific wording of Victoria's requests, and then assured the Reverend that he had done quite the right thing in handling the matter with discretion. As he left, she remained in her doorway, watching the evening light fade from the sky, her mind already beginning to construct the first outlines of what might become a far more serious crime than a simple withdrawal from the choir loft. The weekend arrived with a peculiar quality of stillness that seemed to pervade Little Paddleton, as though the village itself were holding its breath and waiting for something significant to occur. The shops remained quiet, the streets nearly empty save for the occasional villager hurrying about their weekend errands, with their eyes focused determinedly ahead, as though unwilling to engage in the casual conversations that normally characterized the social life of the community. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken to her garden with particular dedication, pruning her roses with meticulous care and tending to the beds with an attention that suggested she was engaged in far more than simple horticultural maintenance. In reality, her hands worked with practiced efficiency, while her mind remained entirely focused upon the puzzle that continued to expand and deepen with each passing hour. She had spent the previous evening carefully reviewing everything she knew about the women of Little Paddleton, the various triangles of friendship and enmity that formed and reformed throughout the seasons, the quiet conflicts that simmered beneath the surface of village life. On Saturday morning, Miss Marple received a visitor who would prove instrumental in altering the trajectory of her investigation. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the new soprano soloist, arrived at the cottage with a nervousness that manifested itself in the form of fidgeting hands and a somewhat breathless manner of speaking. She had come, she explained, because she felt that Miss Marple was the sort of person who would understand her concerns and who, perhaps, might offer some guidance regarding a matter that had been troubling her considerably. Eleanor settled into the chair across from Miss Marple, accepted a cup of tea with trembling fingers, and then proceeded to reveal that she had discovered something peculiar while organizing the hymn books in the choir loft following Thursday's practice. She had found a letter, she said, though she had not read it initially, believing it to be private correspondence that had been accidentally left behind. However, when she had attempted to locate the owner by checking the address on the envelope, she had noticed that it bore only initials, and she had felt compelled to look inside, just briefly, just enough to understand its nature. What Eleanor had discovered in that brief inspection was a letter of considerable emotional intensity, one that suggested a person in genuine distress, a person confronting knowledge that had become psychologically unbearable. Eleanor had been troubled by this discovery, she admitted, because she recognized the handwriting as belonging to Mrs. Victoria Harrington, and because the letter appeared to be addressed to someone whose identity was concealed behind the initial fifth H. Eleanor had left the letter where she found it, she assured Miss Marple, but the experience had unsettled her profoundly. She had not slept well the previous night, unable to dismiss the feeling that she had stumbled upon something of genuine significance, something that might indicate that Mrs. Harrington was experiencing some form of crisis. Eleanor had come to Miss Marple because she did not know what to do with this information, whether it should be reported to someone in authority, whether her discovery of the letter constituted an invasion of privacy that she should feel guilty about, whether she bore any responsibility for whatever distress Mrs. Harrington might be experiencing. Miss Marple listened to this confession with the calm demeanor that had become her characteristic response to such revelations. She assured Eleanor that the young woman had done nothing wrong in discovering the letter, that such accidents of discovery happen quite frequently in village life, and that the most important thing was not to speak of it to anyone else. She then proceeded to ask Eleanor a series of apparently casual questions about her work at the school, her living situation, her family connections, and her history in Little Paddleton. These questions, seemingly tangential to the matter at hand, were in fact carefully designed to extract information about Eleanor's position within the social hierarchy of the village and her potential connections to the other people involved in this emerging drama. By the time Eleanor left the cottage, with her anxieties somewhat calmed but not entirely resolved, Miss Marple had formed a much clearer picture of the young woman's circumstances and possibilities. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Thornfield Manor, the largest estate in the village, which was owned and inhabited by Mr. James Harrington, Victoria's son, and his wife Catherine. The manor was an impressive Victorian structure, old towers and elaborate stonework, set back from the road behind a long avenue of ancient oaks. Catherine answered the door. A woman in her early 50s with carefully maintained blonde hair and the kind of practiced smile that suggested she was accustomed to managing interactions with village visitors. Miss Marple had come, she explained, to inquire whether Catherine might have any suggestions for a particular gardening difficulty that had been troubling her rose bushes, a pretext that was so perfectly ordinary that Catherine could hardly do anything but invite her inside and offer to discuss the matter over tea. As they sat in the pleasant morning room that overlooked the manor gardens, Miss Marple steered the conversation with remarkable subtlety toward the subject of family relationships and the various stresses that could sometimes affect even the closest of familial bonds. Catherine, it seemed, was more than willing to discuss such matters, and she eventually revealed that there had been considerable tension within the Harrington family in recent weeks. Victoria had been distracted and distant, Catherine reported, and she had noticed that Victoria seemed to have been avoiding James, declining invitations to spend time at the manor and making excuses when family gatherings were scheduled. Catherine had attributed this distance to nothing more serious than the various minor ailments that seemed to plague older women, but she acknowledged that Victoria's behavior had been somewhat unusual by her standards. It was when Miss Marple asked, with careful casualness, whether Victoria had received any visitors recently, or whether Catherine had noticed any unusual correspondence arriving at the manor, that Catherine's expression shifted slightly. She had noticed, Catherine admitted, that Victoria had seemed particularly upset following a telephone call earlier in the week. Catherine had not overheard the conversation, but she had caught sight of Victoria afterward, and the older woman's face had been quite pale, her hands trembling as she held her telephone. Catherine had asked if anything was wrong, but Victoria had claimed that it was merely a wrong number, nothing of importance. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully, thanked Catherine for her hospitality and for the tea, and then took her leave, pausing only to admire the magnificent roses that grew along the drive as she departed. By the time she returned to her cottage, the pieces of the puzzle had begun to assume a far more troubling configuration, one that suggested that, whatever secret Victoria Harrington was protecting, it was significant enough to threaten the stability of her most important family relationships and to trigger a psychological crisis of considerable proportions. The choir practice on Thursday evening took on an entirely different character once Miss Marple arrived at the church with her knitting and her carefully composed demeanor. The rehearsal was scheduled to continue preparations for the Harvest Festival concert, which was now less than a week away, and Reverend Whitmore appeared to be laboring under considerable stress regarding the various technical matters that required resolution before the performance could proceed. Eleanor Finch had arrived early, as she now did for every practice, and was running through her soprano passages with meticulous attention to diction and phrasing, determined that her rendition of the Handel piece would be flawless. It was while Eleanor was singing that Miss Marple noticed something of considerable interest. Eleanor's voice wavered slightly whenever she reached the highest notes of the aria, a technical difficulty that suggested either nervousness or a physical strain of some kind. This observation, when combined with Miss Marple's recollection of Eleanor's trembling hands and anxious demeanor during her visit to the cottage, began to suggest a pattern of emotional disturbance that warranted closer investigation during the interval that typically occurred. Halfway through the practice, Miss Marple made her way to the back of the church, where Reverend Whitmore was making notes on the order of service for the concert. She inquired whether he had heard anything from Victoria Harrington, whether there had been any communication from her regarding the possibility of her return to the choir or any indication of the nature of her distress. The Reverend admitted that he had received no further correspondence from Victoria, though he had attempted to telephone her on 2 occasions, only to be told by her housekeeper that Mrs. Harrington was not receiving visitors or telephone calls. This news troubled him considerably, he confessed, because it suggested that Victoria's difficulties were of a more serious nature than a simple temporary indisposition. Miss Marple assured him that such episodes were not uncommon in village life, that sometimes people needed to withdraw from their ordinary routines in order to confront personal matters, and that the kindest thing one could do was to respect their need for privacy while remaining available should they require assistance. It was after the practice had concluded, and the choir members were dispersing into the November night, that Miss Marple encountered something that would prove to be the first genuine breakthrough in her investigation. As she was gathering her knitting and preparing to leave, Margaret Finch, Eleanor's older sister, approached her with an air of hesitation that suggested she had been wrestling with the decision to speak for some time. Margaret was a nurse at the village hospital, a woman in her late 50s with the brisk, practical manner that characterized her profession, and she was not someone who typically engaged in idle gossip or village speculation. However, she had something troubling to share, she said, something that had been weighing upon her conscience sink. The previous Tuesday, and she believed that Miss Marple, as a person of discretion and wisdom, might be the appropriate person to confide in. What Margaret proceeded to reveal was that she had been working the evening shift at the hospital on Tuesday night when Victoria Harrington had arrived at the casualty ward in a state of considerable emotional distress. Victoria had presented herself to the admitting nurse, claiming to have slipped and struck her head, though Margaret, who had been consulted regarding the injury, had noticed that the contusions on Victoria's scalp did not appear consistent with the story of a simple domestic accident. More troubling still, Victoria had seemed extremely anxious about whether her presence at the hospital would be reported to anyone in the village, and she had specifically requested that no record of her visit be entered into the general hospital system, a request that, while unusual, was technically permissible if the patient refused formal treatment and admission. Margaret had examined Victoria's injuries and determined that while they were not serious, they were certainly concerning enough to warrant investigation into their actual cause. However, Victoria had declined to answer any questions regarding how she had sustained the injuries, had insisted upon leaving the hospital, and had departed into the night with a look of such profound despair that Margaret had been unable to dismiss the encounter from her mind. This revelation opened an entirely new dimension to the mystery that had been unfolding throughout the week. The letter that had threatened to reveal Victoria's secrets, the sudden withdrawal from the choir, the distancing from family members, and now evidence of physical injury that Victoria was desperately attempting to conceal. These pieces began to suggest a narrative far darker and more complex than Miss Marple had initially imagined. The question was no longer simply what secret Victoria was protecting, but whether that secret involved an act of violence, whether it was a secret she was keeping on behalf of someone else, or whether it was a matter entirely different from what the evidence thus far suggested. Miss Marple thanked Margaret for her courage in sharing this information, and assured her that she would treat the matter with appropriate discretion, while considering whether any action needed to be taken. As Miss Marple walked home through the dark streets of Little Paddleton, her mind was working at extraordinary speed, processing the new information and attempting to fit it into the framework of understanding that she had been constructing throughout the week. A woman does not sustain injuries to her head and then attempt to conceal them unless she believes that the revelation of those injuries would create serious consequences. Equally, a woman does not receive a letter threatening exposure of her secrets unless someone has genuinely discovered something about her that she wishes to keep hidden. The combination of these elements suggested that Victoria Harrington was not a victim of circumstances, but rather a person caught in a situation of her own making, someone whose actions or inactions had created a crisis that was now spiraling beyond her ability to control. And somewhere within this emerging narrative was the identity of M, the mysterious letter writer, the person who knew Victoria's secret and who felt compelled to expose it, a person who was currently, Miss Marple suspected, moving through the village with their own burden of knowledge and distress. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage and settled once again into her familiar armchair, she had begun to form preliminary hypotheses regarding the nature of Victoria's secret and the possible identity of the letter writer. However, she remained cautious, understanding that premature certainty was often the enemy of truth. She had learned through decades of observation that human beings were endlessly capable of surprising one, that the obvious explanation was frequently misleading, and that the most dangerous secrets were often those that involved not single individuals, but entire networks of complicit silence. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin to move beyond observation into the realm of gentle but determined investigation, and she would discover, in the process, whether her emerging theories bore any resemblance to the actual truth of what was occurring in Little Paddleton. Friday morning arrived with a crisp clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of the village landscape, the frost that had settled overnight glistening on the grass, and the bare branches of the trees like tiny diamonds scattered across a grey canvas. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and took her morning tea in the garden room of her cottage, a small space filled with potted plants and comfortable furniture that allowed her to observe the village activities while remaining herself unobserved. From this vantage point, she witnessed the arrival of the postman at various houses, noticed which villagers ventured out into the cold morning, and carefully observed the rhythms and patterns that governed the daily life of Little Paddleton. It was while she was engaged in this quiet observation that she noticed something of particular interest: James Harrington's motor car departing from Thornfield Manor at an unusually early hour, with James himself at the wheel, and an expression on his face that suggested preoccupation or concern. This sighting prompted Miss Marple to action. She completed her breakfast with deliberate haste, and then dressed herself in her warmest coat and most practical shoes, the sort of attire that suggested a woman about to embark upon errands rather than idle visiting. Her destination was the village library, a small but well-appointed establishment housed in what had once been a Victorian townhouse and now presided over by Miss Catherine Ashford, a woman in her 60s who had held the position for more than 30 years. Miss Ashford was, by the nature of her position, one of the best sources of historical information available in the village, and she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the various families, scandals, and significant events that had shaped Little Paddleton's character over the decades. Miss Marple had always found Miss Ashford to be cooperative in such inquiries, particularly when the questions were posed with sufficient subtlety to suggest genuine research interests rather than simple gossip gathering. Upon arriving at the library, Miss Marple explained that she was attempting to trace the history of some of the prominent families in the village for what she described as a project of local historical interest. She was particularly interested, she mentioned, in the Harrington family, and wondered whether Miss Ashford might possess any newspaper clippings or other historical documents that could illuminate the family's history over the past several decades. Miss Ashford, delighted by this request, proceeded to conduct Miss Marple to the archives room, a small chamber at the back of the library, where various historical documents were organized in filing cabinets. Together, they began to examine newspaper clippings, old photographs, and various memoranda that documented significant events in the village's past. What emerged from this examination was a considerably more complex picture of the Harrington family than Miss Marple had previously possessed. While the family was indeed prominent and financially secure, there had been a significant scandal approximately 20 years earlier when Victoria's husband, Henry Harrington, had been accused of financial impropriety in connection with his business dealings. The accusations had been serious enough to warrant newspaper coverage and investigation by the authorities, though ultimately no charges had been filed. The documents suggested that the matter had been resolved through a combination of legal maneuvering and financial settlement, though the precise details were somewhat obscured by the passage of time and the discretion of those involved. More intriguingly, there had been a daughter mentioned in the documents, a child born to Henry and Victoria, who had apparently departed the village at the time of the scandal and had not been seen since. The newspaper articles made only vague references to the daughter, referring to her as the Harringtons' unmarried daughter, and mentioning that she had chosen to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Miss Marple's interest in this historical detail was profound, though she endeavoured to conceal the full extent of her engagement. She asked Miss Ashford whether she recalled anything further about this daughter, whether she remembered her name or the circumstances of her departure from the village. Miss Ashford, consulting her memory with the care of someone accustomed to precision, recalled that the daughter's name had been Jennifer, and that she had been a young woman of perhaps 20 or 21 at the time of her departure. There had been considerable speculation among the village residents, Miss Ashford mentioned, regarding the reasons for her departure, with various theories circulating about whether she had been sent away deliberately or had chosen to leave of her own volition. The matter had never been definitively resolved, and Jennifer Harrington had never returned to Little Paddleton, as far as anyone could determine. Armed with this new information, Miss Marple thanked Miss Ashford for her assistance and departed the library with her mind working at a considerably accelerated pace. The existence of this daughter, her mysterious departure, and the apparent attempt by the family to erase her from the village's collective memory suddenly seemed extraordinarily significant. The letter writer, Miss Marple hypothesized, might well be someone connected to Jennifer Harrington, or possibly even Jennifer herself, though that seemed unlikely given that she had departed the village so many years previously. However, the secret that Victoria Harrington was guarding might very well be connected to her daughter's departure and the reasons why that departure had been deemed necessary by the family. And if that were the case, then the question became not simply why Victoria had withdrawn from the choir, but why someone had suddenly chosen to force the revelation of a secret that had been successfully buried for 2 decades. Upon returning to her cottage, Miss Marple sat down at her writing desk and composed a carefully worded letter to a contact she maintained in the city, a retired policeman named Sir Henry Clitheroe, with whom she had conducted correspondence for many years. In this letter, she requested that Sir Henry perform some discreet investigation into the circumstances surrounding Jennifer Harrington's departure from Little Paddleton 20 years previously, asking specifically whether any official records existed regarding the matter, and whether Sir Henry possessed any connections who might be able to provide additional information about what had actually transpired. She explained that she was engaged in a matter of some delicacy and that any information provided would be treated with absolute confidentiality. This letter, she knew, would take several days to reach Sir Henry and several more days for him to respond. But she was not a woman who believed that haste necessarily improved the quality of investigation. Sometimes, she had learned, the most important discoveries required patience, and the threads of the past, once disturbed, had a peculiar tendency to unravel in unexpected ways. Saturday morning brought with it an unexpected development that would significantly alter the trajectory of Miss Marple's investigation. She was in the process of arranging fresh flowers in the vase that occupied the center of her dining table when she received a visitor of considerable urgency, Dr. Michael Patterson, the village physician, who arrived at her door looking considerably more agitated than his typically calm professional demeanor usually permitted. Dr. Patterson had been practicing in Little Paddleton for nearly 15 years and had maintained a cordial, if somewhat formal, relationship with Miss Marple, based primarily upon the occasional tea they had shared and the philosophical discussions they had engaged in regarding the nature of human suffering and the medical profession's capacity to address it. However, his arrival at her cottage on this particular Saturday morning suggested that he was coming not in his capacity as a village social contact, but rather as someone who had been wrestling with a professional and ethical dilemma of considerable complexity. Dr. Patterson seated himself in Miss Marple's sitting room with the obvious reluctance of a man about to violate professional confidentiality, though one who felt compelled to do so by circumstances that had transcended the normal boundaries of medical discretion. He explained, with careful attention to the legal and ethical implications of what he was about to share, that he had received a visit from a patient earlier that week, whose condition and apparent distress had raised serious concerns in his mind. He could not, he emphasized, reveal the patient's identity, as to do so would constitute a violation of the sacred trust that existed between physician and patient. However, He felt that he must share with someone of Miss Marple's wisdom and discretion certain observations that he had made, because he believed that a crime might be in the process of occurring, and he was uncertain whether his professional obligations superseded his obligations as a citizen. What Dr. Patterson proceeded to reveal was that a woman from the village had presented herself at his surgery complaining of severe emotional distress, anxiety attacks, and insomnia. The patient had reported feeling unable to maintain her normal daily activities and had expressed concerns that circumstances in her life had become psychologically unbearable. More significantly, the patient had made certain statements suggesting that she was in possession of knowledge regarding a serious matter, knowledge that had created a moral dilemma for her and was producing profound psychological consequences. The patient had not explicitly stated what this knowledge concerned, but Dr. Patterson had formed the impression, based upon various subtle references and the emotional intensity with which the patient had discussed the matter, that the knowledge involved some form of wrongdoing or crime that had occurred in the village. Miss Marple listened to this account with her characteristic calm, though her mind was racing with the implications of what she was hearing. She asked Dr. Patterson, with careful delicacy, whether he had any sense of whether this patient was the potential victim of some crime, or whether they might be involved in a crime themselves. Dr. Patterson considered this question with evident care before responding that his impression was that the patient was neither a perpetrator nor a traditional victim, but rather someone who had become aware of a crime or wrongdoing after the fact and was now struggling with the question of whether and how to make that knowledge known. He had suggested that the patient speak with the appropriate authorities, but the patient had expressed considerable fear regarding what the consequences might be should certain information become public, and had indicated that she was attempting to work through the situation in a more private manner. Upon reflection, Miss Marple posed another carefully crafted question: whether Dr. Patterson believed the patient to be in immediate danger. Dr. Patterson replied that he did not believe the patient was in danger of harm from external sources, but that he was genuinely concerned about the patient's psychological state and the possibility that the stress she was experiencing might eventually produce serious consequences for her mental health. The patient had appeared to be on the verge of a significant emotional crisis, he reported, and he was concerned that she might eventually do something drastic if the situation were not resolved in some constructive manner. After Dr. Patterson had departed, having relieved himself of the burden of knowledge that had been troubling him, but having carefully maintained the confidentiality of his patient's identity, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room and considered what she had learned. The patient in question was almost certainly Eleanor Finch, though Miss Marple could not be entirely certain. Eleanor possessed the psychological profile that Dr. Patterson had described, a woman aware of something significant, struggling with the moral implications of that awareness, and experiencing genuine emotional distress as a result. But the question remained: what was it that Eleanor knew? What was the nature of the secret or crime that she had become aware of? Miss Marple decided that it was time to move beyond passive observation and gentle questioning into a more direct form of engagement. She composed a note to Eleanor, inviting her to tea on Sunday afternoon, with the explanation that she was feeling somewhat lonely and would greatly appreciate the company of a younger person for a few hours. The note was carefully constructed to avoid any suggestion that Miss Marple possessed knowledge of Eleanor's distress or that the invitation was anything other than a simple social engagement. However, Miss Marple knew that Eleanor would recognize the invitation for what it actually was, an opportunity to speak with someone who understood her situation and who possessed the wisdom and discretion to listen without judgment. Sunday afternoon arrived with threatening clouds gathering on the horizon, suggesting that rain would come before evening. Eleanor arrived at the cottage promptly at 3 o'clock, dressed neatly and appearing somewhat more composed than she had during her previous visit, though Miss Marple could detect underlying anxiety in the way Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she removed her coat. They settled into the comfortable chairs beside the fire, and Miss Marple began by discussing inconsequential matters: the progress of the choir preparations, the likelihood of a successful concert, the various details of village life that formed the surface structure of their community. Only after Eleanor had relaxed somewhat After she had accepted a cup of tea and a small plate of biscuits, did Miss Marple gently steer the conversation toward more significant matters. She asked Eleanor, with apparent casualness, whether the young woman had been sleeping well, whether she seemed to be managing her various responsibilities satisfactorily. Eleanor's response was hesitant, and it was this hesitation tea prompted Miss Marple to speak with greater directness than was her usual habit. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care and regarded Eleanor with an expression of such profound compassion that the younger woman's carefully maintained composure seemed to crumble almost instantaneously. Eleanor's hands began to tremble more noticeably, and her eyes filled with tears that she attempted unsuccessfully to blink away. Miss Marple, without any further preamble or gentle introduction, simply said that she believed Eleanor was carrying a burden that was too heavy for one person to bear alone, and that she, Miss Marple, was offering Eleanor the opportunity to share that burden if she wished to do so. The words were spoken with such absolute certainty, such complete understanding, that Eleanor appeared unable to maintain any further pretense of normalcy. The young woman's face crumpled, and she began to weep, not with the controlled tears of social distress, but with the deep, wrenching sobs of someone who had been holding back an accumulation of emotion and fear for far too long. When Eleanor's tears had subsided somewhat, when she had regained sufficient composure to speak coherently, she began her confession with words that tumbled out in a somewhat disordered rush. She explained that she had made a discovery approximately 2 weeks previously, a discovery that had seemed insignificant at first, but that had gradually revealed itself to be of considerable gravity. She had been working late at the school one evening, she said, staying after the other staff members had departed in order to organize some classroom materials. While moving boxes in the storage room, she had accidentally discovered a locked drawer hidden beneath a stack of educational supplies, a drawer that had been partially concealed and which she would never have found had she not been rearranging the entire storage system. The drawer had not been locked securely, merely held closed with a simple catch, and when Eleanor had opened it, more out of curiosity than with any deliberate intention to invade privacy, she had discovered a collection of old photographs and documents. Among these photographs was a series of pictures that appeared to have been taken approximately 20 years previously, pictures that showed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Victoria Harrington, though the woman in the photographs was clearly much younger, perhaps in her late teens or early 20s. The woman in the photographs appeared to be pregnant, and in several of the images she was shown with what appeared to be a newborn infant. Eleanor had found these photographs deeply troubling, though at first she was uncertain why. She had examined the documents accompanying the photographs and had discovered what appeared to be hospital records, adoption papers, and various other official documents that appeared to relate to the birth and subsequent placement of a child for adoption. It was only when Eleanor had begun to piece together the various fragments of information that she had understood the full significance of what she had discovered. The young woman in the photographs was almost certainly Jennifer Harrington, Victoria's daughter, and the documents appeared to suggest that Jennifer had given birth to a child at a very young age, a child who had subsequently been placed for adoption. The documents also suggested that Victoria Harrington had been directly involved in arranging this adoption, and that the matter had been conducted with considerable secrecy and discretion. Eleanor had been profoundly disturbed by this discovery, not merely because of the information itself, but because she had subsequently realized where these materials had been hidden and what this guessed about who had placed them there and why they had been concealed. The storage room where Eleanor had discovered the drawer belonged to the school, but the drawer itself had appeared to be the property of someone who had access to the school outside of normal hours. Eleanor had gradually pieced together that the most likely person to have access to the storage room and the knowledge of where documents might be hidden was someone who worked at the school in an administrative or maintenance capacity. After considerable internal deliberation, Eleanor had realized that the most probable candidate was Margaret Summers, the school's administrative assistant, who had worked there for many years and who had access to all areas of the building at all hours. More significantly, Eleanor had eventually recognized that Margaret Summers was actually Margaret Harrington, using a different surname for professional purposes, and that Margaret was almost certainly Jennifer's older sister, not merely a coincidental employee of the school. Eleanor had been overwhelmed by this realization and had attempted to process what it might mean. If Margaret was Jennifer's sister and had been hiding these documents at the school, then Margaret must have been in contact with Jennifer, or must have somehow obtained these materials from her. But why would Margaret hide such documents? Why would she keep evidence of Jennifer's past hidden away? Eleanor had eventually formed a hypothesis that had terrified her. Perhaps Margaret had hidden the documents for the express purpose of having them discovered by someone, perhaps as a form of blackmail or pressure directed toward Victoria Harrington. And Eleanor herself, by discovering the documents, had become unwittingly complicit in whatever scheme Margaret might be engaged in. This realization had prompted Eleanor to attempt to locate Margaret and confer on her regarding the documents, but Margaret had proven remarkably evasive, and Eleanor had found herself unable to find an appropriate moment or manner in which to raise the subject. Eleanor had then done something that she deeply regretted. She had attempted to secure the documents by removing them from the drawer and hiding them in a different location. However, before she could move them, Margaret had discovered her in the storage room, and an awkward conversation had ensued in which Eleanor had attempted to explain her presence there, without revealing what she had actually discovered. Margaret, however, appeared to have understood immediately what Eleanor had found, and she had extracted a promise from Eleanor that she would not reveal the documents to anyone, and would not attempt to interfere in matters that did not concern her. Eleanor had agreed to this condition out of fear, but the agreement had done nothing to alleviate her moral distress. She had felt that she possessed knowledge that should be revealed, that Victoria Harrington had a right to know that her daughter's past was being actively threatened or used as leverage against her. Yet she had also felt bound by the promise she had made to Margaret, and this conflict had produced the psychological crisis that had brought her to seek assistance from Miss Marple. Eleanor confessed that she had written the letter that Miss Marple had found in the choir loft, a letter expressing her knowledge and her distress, though she could not bring herself to place it where Victoria would actually receive it. Instead, she had left it in the choir loft, hoping that somehow Victoria would find it and understand that her secret was no longer safe, that she needed to confront the situation that had been developing in her family. Eleanor's confession ended with an expression of profound guilt and confusion, and a desperate plea for guidance regarding what she should do next. Miss Marple listened to Eleanor's complete confession without interruption, maintaining her characteristic expression of calm composure, even as her mind was rapidly reorganizing the entire framework of her understanding regarding the mystery that had been unfolding in Little Paddleton. When Eleanor had finished speaking, when the younger woman had exhausted the full measure of her distress and guilt, Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care and began to speak in the measured, thoughtful tones that had become her trademark. She assured Eleanor that the young woman had done nothing fundamentally wrong, that her discovery of the documents had been accidental rather than deliberately intrusive, and that her subsequent attempts to navigate the moral complexities of the situation demonstrated a conscience of considerable sensitivity. However, Miss Marple continued, Eleanor had made a significant error in judgment by allowing herself to be bound by Margaret's demand for silence, because in doing so she had become complicit in what appeared to be a form of coercion or blackmail being directed against Victoria Harrington. What had become clear to Miss Marple through Eleanor's account was that Margaret Finch, the school's administrative assistant, and Eleanor's own older sister, was engaged in a deliberate campaign to pressure Victoria into some form of action or revelation. The hidden documents were not merely evidence of Jennifer's past, they were a weapon being held over Victoria's head, a threat designed to force Victoria to confront her past or to make some form of concession or confession. Margaret's motivation for engaging in such a campaign remained somewhat unclear, though Miss Marple began to hypothesize that Margaret might be acting not merely from a desire for revenge or justice, but possibly on behalf of Jennifer herself. or in response to some perceived wrong that had been committed against Jennifer by Victoria or the Harrington family. Miss Marple posed a series of carefully constructed questions to Eleanor, designed to extract additional information that might illuminate Margaret's motivations and connections. She asked whether Eleanor was aware of any particular friendship or relationship between Margaret and Jennifer Harrington, whether Eleanor had ever heard Margaret speak about Jennifer or the circumstances of her departure from the village. Eleanor admitted that she had overheard various fragmentary conversations between Margaret and others that suggested Margaret possessed considerable knowledge about Jennifer's history, and that Margaret seemed to harbor significant anger regarding the circumstances of Jennifer's past, and the role that Victoria had played in those circumstances. More significantly, Eleanor mentioned that she had once overheard Margaret on the telephone, speaking to someone in a manner that suggested she was discussing Jennifer's current whereabouts and circumstances, suggesting that Margaret had maintained contact with Jennifer over the years. Armed with these additional details, Miss Marple informed Eleanor that it was essential that Eleanor provide her with access to the documents that Margaret had hidden, or at minimum that Eleanor describe their contents in sufficient detail that Miss Marple could form a complete understanding of what information they contained. Eleanor hesitated at this request, expressing concern that to do so would constitute a further betrayal of Margaret's trust and would potentially escalate the situation. However, Miss Marple pointed out, with gentle but absolute firmness, that Eleanor's promise to Margaret had been secured through coercion and fear, and therefore held no moral force whatsoever. More importantly, Eleanor's continued silence in the face of what appeared to be deliberate blackmail constituted a form of complicity in wrongdoing, and Eleanor bore a responsibility to ensure that the matter was properly addressed before it escalated further. Miss Marple then posed a question that seemed to catch Eleanor entirely off guard: whether Eleanor believed that Margaret might be capable of committing a serious crime in order to protect her campaign against Victoria, or to ensure that Jennifer's past remained hidden or revealed according to Margaret's own timeline and requirements. Eleanor's immediate response was denial, but Miss Marple observed that the denial came somewhat too quickly, as though Eleanor had already considered this possibility herself and had been attempting to suppress the thought. Miss Marple gently pointed out that blackmail, coercion, and deliberate psychological manipulation were themselves crimes, and that a person willing to engage in such activities had already demonstrated a willingness to cross certain moral boundaries. Eleanor's expression shifted as this reality seemed to penetrate her consciousness, and she began to acknowledge that she had harbored concerns about Margaret's emotional stability and the potential consequences of Margaret's campaign against Victoria. It was at this point that Miss Marple made a decision that would significantly alter the trajectory of her investigation. She explained to Eleanor that she intended to visit Victoria Harrington directly and inform her of the situation that was developing, that Victoria needed to be made aware of the threat to her peace and security so that she could take appropriate action to protect herself and her family. Eleanor expressed alarm at this proposed course of action, concerned that such a visit might further upset Victoria or might cause Victoria to take some drastic action if she discovered that Eleanor had been involved in revealing her secret. However, Miss Marple assured Eleanor that she would handle the matter with appropriate delicacy and would not reveal Eleanor's involvement any more than was absolutely necessary. The following morning, therefore, Miss Marple dressed herself in her most formal attire and requested that the village taxi service transport her to Thornfield Manor, where Victoria Harrington resided. The manor was quiet when she arrived, the gardens grey and bare beneath the November sky, the windows of the great house appearing almost unwelcoming in their blankness. A housekeeper answered the door and initially expressed that Mrs. Harrington was not receiving visitors, but when Miss Marple provided her name and explained that she possessed information of considerable urgency regarding a matter of family concern, the housekeeper agreed to inquire whether Mrs. Harrington would consent to see her. Several minutes elapsed before the housekeeper returned and invited Miss Marple inside, conducting her through the elegant hallways of the manor to a small study where Victoria Harrington stood waiting, her face pale and her expression suggesting that she had been expecting some form of crisis to arrive at her door. Victoria's initial reaction to Miss Marple's unexpected arrival was one of suspicion and alarm, but Miss Marple's calm demeanor and her immediate explanation that she came bearing information rather than making accusations seemed to shift Victoria's emotional state from fear toward cautious attention. Miss Marple explained, in the careful language of one who had spent a lifetime delivering difficult truths with compass. Ion, that she had become aware that Victoria was the subject of what appeared to be a campaign of coercion conducted by someone in the village, a campaign designed to pressure Victoria into confronting or revealing information related to her daughter Jennifer's past and the circumstances of Jennifer's departure from Little Paddleton. Victoria's face went deathly pale at this explanation, and she sank into a nearby chair as though her legs could no longer support her weight. Miss Marple then proceeded to describe in measured detail the nature of the threat that was being directed against her and the identity of the person who appeared to be orchestrating that threat. Victoria Harrington's reaction to Miss Marple's revelations was one of profound shock, followed by a gradual accumulation of understanding, as though the pieces of a puzzle that had been troubling her for weeks was suddenly falling into place in her mind. She remained silent for several minutes after Miss Marple had finished speaking, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her breathing shallow and constrained. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and she asked Miss Marple how much she actually knew about Jennifer and the circumstances of her departure from Little Paddleton all those years ago. Miss Marple responded with characteristic honesty, explaining that she knew only what she had been able to discover through research and conversation, but that she believed Jennifer had given birth to a child at a young age, and that Victoria had arranged for that child to be placed for adoption. Victoria rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the bare gardens with an expression of such profound sadness that Miss Marple felt a genuine wave of compassion for the older woman. Victoria then began to speak, and as she did, the full complexity, the situation that had been developing in Little Paddleton revealed itself. She explained that Jennifer had become pregnant at the age of 19, the result of a relationship with a young man from outside the village whom the family had deemed unsuitable. The family, and specifically Victoria herself, had determined that the pregnancy should be kept secret and that the child, once born, should be placed for adoption. This decision had been made not out of cruelty, Victoria insisted, but out of a genuine belief that it was in the best interests of both Jennifer and the child, given the social circumstances of the time and the devastating impact that an illegitimate pregnancy would have on Jennifer's future prospects and the family's reputation. However, Victoria continued the experience had traumatized Jennifer profoundly. The young woman had been sent away to a private nursing home in a distant county where she had given birth to a daughter in complete secrecy. The child had been placed for adoption almost immediately, and Jennifer had been instructed never to speak of the matter to anyone. Jennifer had returned to Little Paddleton ostensibly to continue her life as normal, but in reality, she had been broken by the experience. She had eventually moved away from the village, establishing herself in London where she had attempted to build a new life far removed from the family and the circumstances that had caused her such pain. Victoria acknowledged that she deeply regretted the decisions that had been made regarding Jennifer's situation, decisions that she now recognized had been motivated more by concern for social appearance than by genuine care for Jennifer's emotional well-being. The letter that Victoria had received, she explained, had been from Margaret Finch, Eleanor's sister. Margaret had apparently been in contact with Jennifer for several years and eventually come into possession of the documents and photographs related to Jennifer's past. Margaret had written to Victoria with an ultimatum. Either Victoria would provide Margaret with a substantial sum of money, ostensibly as compensation for the suffering Jennifer had endured, or Margaret would ensure that the full story of Jennifer's pregnancy and the forced adoption would be revealed throughout the village. Victoria had been terrified by this threat, not primarily because of the damage to her reputation, but because she had feared how such a revelation might affect her relationships with her son James and his wife Catherine, both of whom remained ignorant of Jennifer's history. Miss Marple listened to this account with her characteristic attentiveness, but she was simultaneously aware that something in Victoria's explanation did not quite align with the evidence that she had accumulated. Victoria claimed to have received Margaret's letter as a threat and ultimatum, yet the letter that Miss Marple had found in the choir loft had been written by someone identified only as M and addressed to someone with the initials 5th H, and that letter had not been a direct threat or ultimatum, but rather an expression of moral distress and an indication that the letter writer could no longer maintain ordinary social relationships as a result of possessing knowledge of wrongdoing. Miss Marple posed a carefully constructed question regarding the exact nature of the letter that Victoria had received and whether there might have been multiple letters exchanged between Victoria and Margaret. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, and she admitted that there had indeed been multiple communications, that Margaret had sent several letters and had made telephone calls as well. The initial communications had been somewhat oblique in their nature, suggesting knowledge without explicit lie stating what that knowledge encompassed. Only in more recent communications had Margaret become more direct in her threats and demands. Victoria admitted that she had been confused and terrified by these communications, uncertain of how to respond or whether she should involve the authorities. It was this emotional turmoil that had prompted her withdrawal from the choir and her attempts to isolate herself from village society, as though removing herself from public view might somehow cause the crisis to resolve itself. Miss Marple then asked Victoria a question that seemed to shift the entire nature of their conversation, whether Victoria had any sense that Margaret might be acting not merely out of a desire for financial gain or revenge, but possibly on behalf of someone else, or in response to some other motivation that had not yet been articulated. Victoria considered this question carefully, and she then revealed something that appeared to have been troubling her considerably. She explained that several weeks ago, before Margaret's communications had begun, Victoria had received a visitor at Thornfield Manor, a young woman who had come seeking information about a possible adoption that had taken place approximately 20 years previously. The visitor had eventually identified herself as the daughter that Jennifer had given birth to, a woman now in her late 20s who had spent years attempting to trace her biological family. Victoria had been extraordinarily shocked by this revelation and had asked the young woman how she had located her, and the visitor had explained that Jennifer herself had provided her with some information and that Margaret Finch had been instrumental in assisting her in making the connection. This revelation seemed to recontextualize the entire situation in Miss Marple's mind. Margaret was not acting out of a desire for personal gain or simple revenge, rather. She appeared to be acting out of a conviction that Victoria and the Harrington family had committed a significant wrong against Jennifer by forcing the adoption and maintaining the secrecy for so many years. Margaret seemed to believe that Jennifer and her biological daughter had a right to have their story acknowledged and their pain recognized, and she was attempting to use coercion and the threat of exposure to force Victoria to confront the consequences of the family's past decisions. What had begun to emerge was not a simple case of blackmail, but rather a complex moral drama in which multiple people's sense of justice and righteousness had come into conflict, creating a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control it. Miss Marple's mind was working at extraordinary speed as she processed this new information and began to recognize patterns and connections that had previously remained hidden. She understood now that Margaret Finch's actions, while technically constituting blackmail or coercion, were motivated by a genuine conviction that she was engaged in a form of justice on behalf of Jennifer and her biological daughter. However, Miss Marple also recognized that Margaret's approach had become increasingly dangerous and uncontrolled, particularly given the emotional instability that had driven Victoria to the point where she had sustained injuries that required hospital treatment. Miss Marple posed a careful question regarding the nature of those injuries and the circumstances under which they had been sustained, and Victoria's response revealed something of considerable significance. Victoria explained that she had sustained the injuries to her head during a confrontation with Margaret approximately 5 days previously. Margaret had arrived at Thornfield Manor in an extremely agitated state, claiming that she had covered that Victoria had hired a private investigator to locate Jennifer and her biological daughter, apparently with the intention of discovering what information they might possess regarding Margaret's activities. Margaret had become increasingly hostile and accusatory, suggesting that Victoria was attempting to threaten or intimidate Jennifer into silence regarding the adoption and the circumstances of her past. The confrontation had become physical when Margaret, in her emotional distress, had pushed Victoria, causing her to strike her head against the edge of a door frame. Victoria had been badly frightened by this escalation of violence and had immediately hidden the evidence of her injuries, fearful that if the truth became known, Margaret might be arrested and charged with assault, which Victoria somehow believed would cause further harm to Jennifer and would compound the injustices that had already been committed. This revelation was profoundly troubling to Miss Marple, for it indicated that the situation in Little Paddleton had escalated well beyond the point of simple blackmail or psychological manipulation into the realm of actual violence. More significantly, Victoria's response to this violence, her decision to conceal it and protect Margaret from the consequences of her actions, suggested that Victoria herself had become psychologically damaged by the entire situation, that she was no longer thinking or behaving rationally. Miss Marple recognized that she needed to take decisive action to prevent the situation from deteriorating further, yet she also recognized that such action would need to be undertaken with considerable care and discretion in order to avoid causing additional harm to the various parties involved. Miss Marple explained to Victoria that the situation had progressed beyond the point where it could be managed privately, that Margaret's behavior constituted not merely blackmail, but also assault, and that steps needed to be taken to ensure that no further violence would occur. She suggested that Victoria should contact the local authorities and make a formal statement regarding both the blackmail attempt and the physical assault, while simultaneously arranging for a meeting with Margaret and Jennifer in the presence of a neutral third party who could mediate the situation and attempt to reach some form of resolution that would be acceptable to all parties. Victoria resisted this suggestion strongly, expressing concern about the public scandal that would result from such action, about the damage to her family's reputation and her son's position in the community. However, Miss Marple pointed out with characteristic firmness that the damage to Victoria's reputation and family relationships would be substantially greater if the situation were allowed to continue uncontrolled, if Margaret's behavior escalated further, or if the truth emerged in some more dramatic or public manner. Miss Marple then took an action that was somewhat unusual for her, though not entirely unprecedented. She arranged a private meeting with Inspector Blackwood, the senior police officer responsible for the village and surrounding areas, and provided him with a carefully edited account of the situation that had been developing in Little Paddleton. She did not mention Eleanor's involvement or her discovery of the documents, instead suggesting that she had come into possession of information regarding blackmail and assault through her various conversations with village residents. She explained the basic outline of the situation involving Victoria, Margaret, and the matter of Jennifer's past adoption, and she suggested that the inspector might benefit from speaking informally with the parties involved in order to determine whether any criminal complaints needed to be filed. The inspector, who had worked with Miss Marple on previous matters, and who had come to respect her judgment considerably, agreed to conduct some preliminary inquiries, though he cautioned that without a formal complaint from Victoria, his ability to intervene would be somewhat limited. Miss Marple assured him that Victoria would likely be prepared to make such a complaint once she had been convinced of the necessity of doing so, and that in the meantime the inspector's informal inquiries might serve to convince the various parties involved of the seriousness of the situation. Over the course of the following 2 days, Miss Marple engaged in what might best be described as a carefully orchestrated campaign of gentle but firm persuasion designed to move all the parties involved toward a resolution of the crisis that would be as constructive and least damaging as possible. She arranged for Eleanor to meet with Margaret, and she was present at that meeting to serve as a neutral observer and mediator. She encouraged Victoria to meet with Jennifer and her biological daughter, a meeting that took place in Miss Marple's cottage and which, while emotionally fraught and difficult, seemed to produce a measure of genuine reconciliation and understanding among the parties involved. She spoke with Inspector Blackwood regarding the necessity of formal charges being filed, and she helped to negotiate a situation in which Victoria would file a complaint regarding both the blackmail and the assault, with the understanding that the prosecution would proceed in a manner that would take into account the complex circumstances and motivations that had driven Margaret's behavior. By Friday evening of that week, the immediate crisis appeared to have been resolved, at least in its most acute form. Margaret had agreed to cease her campaign against Victor, and had acknowledged that her methods had been inappropriate, though she maintained that her underlying conviction regarding the injustice of Jennifer's forced adoption remained unchanged. Victoria had filed formal complaints with the police, though she had also agreed to work toward a more permanent resolution of the family situation that would acknowledge Jennifer's pain and provide some form of compensation or reconciliation. Eleanor had been relieved of the burden of secrecy that had been weighing upon her, and she appeared to have regained a measure of psychological equilibrium. The village of Little Paddleton, meanwhile, seemed to sense that some significant crisis had been averted, though the full details of what had transpired remained known only to those directly involved in the situation. The Harvest Festival concert proceeded as scheduled on the Saturday evening following the resolution of the immediate crisis, and the performance of the choir was considered by most village residents to be particularly moving and successful. Eleanor Finch sang her soprano solo with a clarity and emotional depth that surprised many who had previously heard her perform, and the audience responded with appreciative applause that seemed to restore a measure of confidence to the young woman who had endured so much psychological distress over the preceding weeks. Miss Marple attended the concert as she always did, sitting in her customary pew with her knitting, observing not only the performance itself, but also the reactions and behaviors of the various choir members and audience members who had been drawn into the drama that had unfolded throughout the week. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully as she watched the concert unfold was the recognition that the crisis that had threatened to tear Little Paddleton apart had, in the end, revealed itself to be rooted not in malice or deliberate criminality, but rather in the profound human need for justice, recognition, and the healing of old wounds. Margaret Finch, who had engaged in behavior that technically constituted blackmail and assault, was fundamentally a woman motivated by compassion for her friend Jennifer and a conviction that the injustices committed against Jennifer demanded acknowledgement and reparation. Victoria Harrington, who had initially appeared to be a victim of Margaret's coercion, was revealed to be a woman who had made difficult choices in the past and who, while now recognizing the harm those choices had caused, had been attempting in her own limited way to mitigate the damage. Eleanor Finch, the young woman whose accidental discovery had precipitated the entire crisis, was simply someone with a conscience sufficiently sensitive to recognize wrongdoing and sufficiently troubled by it to seek guidance from someone she believed possessed greater wisdom. The days following the concert were characterized by a gradual return to the normal rhythms of village life, though with an undercurrent of tension that suggested that the resolution of the crisis was incomplete and that the village remained in a state of heightened awareness regarding the complex dramas that might be unfolding beneath the surface of ordinary social interaction. Miss Marple, as was her custom, maintained her usual patterns of activity, attending church, tending her garden, knitting in her favorite chair, and conducting her regular rounds of social visits throughout the village. However, she also took particular care to monitor the situation involving Victoria, Margaret, Eleanor, and Jennifer, ensuring that the agreements that had been reached were being honored and that no new crises were emerging from the ashes of the old one. It was during one of her visits to the church, approximately 10 days after the concert, that Miss Marple encountered Reverend Whitmore and engaged him in a conversation regarding the choir and the various changes that had occurred in recent weeks. The Reverend expressed his profound relief that Victoria had indicated she might eventually return to her position as soprano soloist, though he acknowledged that he did not expect this to occur in the immediate future. He also mentioned, with evident satisfaction, that the choir had received several new members recently, including Margaret Finch, who had approached him about joining the choir and who had expressed an interest in working toward reconciliation with Victoria through their shared participation in the church's musical activities. This information seemed to Miss Marple to be a positive indication that the various parties involved in the crisis were genuinely attempting to move forward in a constructive manner. Miss Marple received a letter approximately 2 weeks after the resolution of the immediate crisis, a letter that had been sent to her from London, and which bore handwriting that was unfamiliar to her. The letter was from Jennifer Harrington, now living under her married name Jennifer Blackwell, and it expressed the writer's profound gratitude for Miss Marple's intervention in what had threatened to become an irreversible tragedy. Jennifer explained that she had spent more than 20 years attempting to come to terms with the circumstances of her past, with the forced adoption of her daughter and the secrecy that had been imposed upon her by her family. She wrote that the crisis that had unfolded in Little Paddleton, while painful and distressing in many respects, had ultimately provided her with the opportunity to confront her family directly regarding the harm that had been caused, and to begin the process of genuine reconciliation and healing. More significantly, Jennifer wrote that she had been able to establish a relationship with her biological daughter, a young woman named Catherine who was now actively engaged in building bridges between her adoptive family and her biological family. Jennifer expressed her belief that this reconciliation would not have been possible without Miss Marple's intervention and without the willingness of various parties in the village to prioritize emotional truth over social appearance. She thanked Miss Marple for her wisdom, her discretion, and her profound understanding of human nature, and she invited Miss Marple to visit her in London should she ever find the opportunity to do so. Miss Marple's response to Jennifer's letter was brief and characteristically humble. She acknowledged Jennifer's gratitude while gently suggesting that the credit for the resolution of the crisis belonged not to her, but rather to the various people involved, who had, in the end, chosen to prioritize truth and reconciliation over comfort and secrecy. She expressed her hope that Jennifer and her biological daughter would continue to develop their relationship, and that Victoria would eventually come to a place of genuine peace regarding her past decisions. She concluded by noting that she had learned many years ago that human beings possessed a profound capacity for growth and change, and that even circumstances that appeared to be irreversibly damaged could often be repaired through patience, compassion, and a genuine willingness to confront difficult truths. As November gave way to December, and the village prepared for the approaching holiday season, Miss Marple reflected frequently on the events that had transpired and on what they suggested about the nature of human relationships and the complex web of motivations and emotions that connected the residents of Little Paddleton. She recognized that the crisis involving Victoria, Marg, Arrett, Jennifer, and Eleanor had not truly been resolved in any complete or permanent sense, but rather had been moved from an acute phase into a chronic phase in which all the parties involved would continue to work toward genuine reconciliation and healing over a much longer period of time. She understood that this was the nature of human conflict, not dramatically resolved in a single moment, but gradually transformed through the continued efforts of people willing to choose growth and understanding over bitterness and resentment. The choir practices continued throughout December, with Eleanor performing with increasing confidence and skill, with Margaret participating in the back section of the soprano line, and with Miss Marple continuing to sit in her accustomed place with her knitting, observing the interactions among the choir members with the same careful attention that had become her trademark. Occasionally, she would reflect on how easily the situation might have escalated into genuine tragedy, how close everyone involved had come to crossing a point beyond which genuine reconciliation would have been impossible. She recognized that her own intervention, while significant, had been possible only because she had spent decades developing the observational skills and the emotional intelligence necessary to recognize the hidden patterns of human behavior that others had the final section of the missing note from the choir loft should serve as the definitive conclusion to this intricate mystery, bringing together all the threads that have been woven throughout the narrative. Here is section 12. The Christmas season arrived in Little Paddleton with a gentle snowfall that transformed the village into something resembling the idealized pastoral scenes that appeared on the front of greeting cards, and Miss Marple found herself contemplating, as she often did during The quiet moments of the holiday period, the complex nature of the mystery that had occupied her thoughts for the better part of 6 weeks. The case, if it could be called that, had ostensibly been resolved. The blackmail had ceased, the assault had been reported to the authorities, and the various parties involved had begun the long process of reconciliation and healing. Yet Miss Marple recognized that there remained unfinished business, loose threads that had never been fully addressed, and questions that lingered in the margins of the official resolution of the crisis. It was this recognition that prompted her, on a particularly cold December afternoon, to request a private meeting with Inspector Blackwood at the local police station. Inspector Blackwood received Miss Marple in his office with the deference and respect that had become characteristic of his manner whenever she sought his counsel. He offered her tea, which she accepted with her usual politeness, and he settled himself behind his desk with an expression of patient attentiveness that suggested he was prepared to listen to whatever observations or concerns Miss Marple wished to share. Miss Marple began by acknowledging that the official case against Margaret Finch had been closed with the understanding that charges would not be pressed, provided Margaret completed a course of counseling and maintained a period of probation during which she would refrain from any further contact with Victoria Harrington except in the presence of a neutral third party. However, Miss Marple continued, she had come to recognize that the resolution of the case had perhaps been somewhat premature, that there remained aspects of the situation that had not been fully explored or understood. Specifically, Miss Marple explained, she had become troubled by certain inconsistencies in the accounts that had been provided by the various parties involved. Victoria had claimed that the letter she had received from Margaret constituted a direct threat and ultimatum demanding money, yet Eleanor had described finding a letter in the choir loft that appeared to have been written by someone in genuine emotional distress rather than someone engaged in calculated blackmail. Moreover, Miss Marple had begun to wonder whether Margaret had truly been the author of the letter that Eleanor had discovered, or whether that letter had been written by someone else entirely, someone whose identity had been deliberately obscured through the use of the initial M. The inspector listened to these observations with evident interest, and he acknowledged that Miss Marple's concerns possessed merit. He admitted that the investigation into the matter had been conducted somewhat hastily, particularly given the complexity of the situation and the various pressures that had existed to resolve the crisis quickly and discreetly. Miss Marple then posed a carefully constructed series of questions designed to prompt the inspector to reconsider certain aspects of the investigation. She asked whether the handwriting on the letter that Eleanor had found had been conclusively compared to Margaret's handwriting, whether any attempt had been made to verify whether Margaret had actually sent the threatening letters and telephone calls that Victoria had described, and whether anyone had actually confirmed that Margaret possessed the documents and photographs that Victoria had claimed were being used as leverage against her. The inspector's expression shifted as he recognized the implications of Miss Marple's questions. He admitted that the investigation had not been as thorough as it might have been, that the various parties involved had been so eager to move toward resolution that certain fundamental investigative procedures had been neglected. He agreed that it would be prudent to re-examine the evidence more carefully and to conduct more thorough interviews with all parties involved. Miss Marple then requested that the inspector grant her permission to conduct one final interview with Margaret Finch, an interview that would be conducted privately and informally, without any official police presence, but with the understanding that any significant new information would be reported to the inspector immediately afterward. The inspector granted this request with some hesitation, and the following day, Miss Marple invited Margaret Finch to her cottage under the pretense of discussing the choir's upcoming Christmas performance. Margaret arrived punctually, as she always did, displaying the brisk efficiency that characterized her professional manner and the somewhat guarded politeness that had become her standard response to interactions with Miss Marple since the crisis had been resolved. They settled into comfortable chairs, and Miss Marple prepared tea with her customary care, engaging Margaret in initial conversation about inconsequential village matters before gradually shifting the discussion toward more significant topics. It was only after Margaret had begun to relax somewhat that Miss Marple posed the question that would alter the entire understanding of the situation. whether Margaret had, in fact, written the letter that Eleanor had discovered in the choir loft. Margaret's immediate response was a denial, but Miss Marple observed that the denial came somewhat too quickly, with a quality of defensiveness that suggested Margaret was protecting something. Miss Marple then asked, with characteristic gentleness, whether Margaret would be willing to tell her the truth about what had actually occurred, assuring Margaret that she was asking not as a representative of authority, but simply as someone interested. In understanding the full complexity of the human drama that had unfolded in Little Paddleton, Margaret's composure gradually crumbled as she confronted Miss Marple's steady, compassionate gaze. She eventually admitted that she had not written the letter found in the choir loft, but that she had in fact written the threatening letters and made the telephone calls to Victoria Harrington. However, she claimed that she had done so not out of any desire for personal gain, but purely out of a conviction that Victoria needed to be forced to confront the harm that she had caused to Jennifer, and that Victoria needed to acknowledge and attempt to repair that harm. What troubled Miss Marple about this confession, however, was the recognition that Margaret was still not telling the complete truth, that there remained some crucial element of the situation that Margaret was still concealing. Miss Marple then posed a final question, one that seemed to catch Margaret entirely off guard, whether Eleanor had in fact written the letter that was discovered in the choir loft. Margaret's silence in response to this question was eloquent, and Miss Marple pressed forward, suggesting that Eleanor had not merely discovered the hidden documents, but had written the letter herself, had placed it in the choir loft deliberately, hoping that it would somehow reach Victoria and would prompt Victoria to take action to confront her past and her daughter. Margaret eventually admitted that this was indeed what had occurred, that Eleanor had written the letter as an act of moral witness, as an attempt to force the situation into the open so that it could no longer be denied or concealed. What became clear through this final conversation was that the crisis in Little Paddleton had not been the result of Margaret's deliberate blackmail campaign, though Margaret had certainly engaged in coercive behavior. Rather, the crisis had been precipitated by Eleanor's discovery of the hidden documents and her subsequent decision to write a letter expressing her moral distress and her belief that truth needed to be revealed. Margaret had then amplified and intensified this initial breach in the wall of secrecy through her own campaign against Victoria, but Margaret had not created the fundamental crisis. She had merely capitalized upon the opportunity that Eleanor's actions had provided. As Christmas Day arrived and the residents of Little Paddleton prepared to celebrate the holiday with their families and friends, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, reflecting on the entire sequence of events that had transpired over the preceding weeks. She recognized that the mystery had ultimately been less about discovering who had committed a particular crime than about understanding the complex moral landscape in which ordinary people navigated questions of justice, truth, and reconciliation. She understood that Eleanor had acted out of genuine moral conviction, Margaret had acted out of a desire to protect her friend and ensure that injustice was acknowledged, and Victoria had acted out of a combination of old habits of secrecy and a gradually developing willingness to confront her past. The village of Little Paddleton gradually settled back into its familiar patterns of daily life as the new year approached, yet it was a village subtly transformed by the events that had transpired. The residents had been reminded that beneath the surface of ordinary village existence lay depths of human complexity, pain, and the persistent struggle between the desire for comfortable silence and the demand for difficult truth. Miss Marple, having played her part in bringing these truths to light, remained in her cottage, her needles clicking away as they had for so many years, knowing that in small villages and quiet communities throughout England, similar dramas were undoubtedly unfolding, driven by the same timeless human needs and conflicts. She had learned nothing new about human nature through her investigation into the missing note from the choir loft, but she had been reminded once again of the profound importance of listening carefully to what people both said and left unsaid, and of understanding that the solution to even the most complex mysteries often lay not in dramatic revelations but in patient, compassionate attention to the subtle details of human behavior and the hidden motivations that drove ordinary people to extraordinary actions, missed or overlooked.